So I want to add new items to the cart. So a great place to start probably is my shopping page, where I have this add to shopping cart link. Here I want to, let's say, target a route which I'll name add to cart. Of course, name this however you want to name it. And I also have to create this route. I'll do it in my index.js file for now. So in here, I'll configure a new route, a get route it will be, and I'll give it the same path as in my view, add to cart, and I'll expect the ID of the product I want to add to my cart here. This of course has the default middleware function here. And as a side note, you can always leave out the next part if you're not using it, since it gets passed as the third argument. So I'm just writing it to, well, kind of a convention I adapted, but you don't have to. You can also just call this function like this and it should still work, unless I'll leave next here. So in here, basically what I want to do is I want to push my product, the product I want to add to my cart, kind of into my session, but I also want to store it in a cart object, of course. I don't want to push it into my session like a list of products just like that. No, I want to have a cart object in my session. So I'll come back to this cart object in a second. For now, I'll first retrieve my ID. So product ID will just be retrieved from the params this request has, the ID parameter here, of course. And with that, as I said, I want to create a new cart. For that, I'll create a new model in my models folder here. I'll name it cart.js. Now for now, I won't create a Mongoose model since I'm not really storing this cart in database, at least for now. I might add this later when I want to store cards for logged in users maybe, but right now I don't want to. So I'll just write, well, a classical JavaScript constructor function here. And I'll of course export it with module exports to make it available outside of this file too. And this cart constructor function, of which I'll be able to create cart objects later on, is now very important to get right. And on the other hand, there are thousands of ways to do it. So here's my suggestion on how to implement it. This cart here should have some items in it. And I'll change this later. For now, I'll set it to an empty array, just so that we have something to work with. I also want to store the total quantity. I'll set this to 0 by default for a newly created cart, and the total price of my cart items, or yeah, what all the items together cost. Now, I want to be able to add new items to my cart. So I'll add this add function here, which allows me to do just that. And now here, this one is an important one. If I add a new item, I want, of course, I want to get the item. And let's say I also want to get the ID of this item. Because I will, well, of course, always expand my cart. With each new item, I'll add a new item. But here's an important thing. I also want to group my items. If I add Harry Potter, the Harry Potter book here, or we're at video games here. Okay, so if I add Call of Duty 3 times, then I don't want to have just 3 items in my cart, 3 times Call of Duty, but I want to group them because it's one and the same product. So I want to have Call of Duty quantity 3 times. I still want to have the individual game information, so the price, the title, and so on, but I also want to have the aggregated information. Therefore, I can't just push items on an array and then, well, list this array. I could do this, but this would lead to a shopping cart where we might have such a list of, well, just the same game, for example, instead of one row where we have game title and then quantity 10 or whatever. So this is an important thing to get right. Therefore, what I'll do is whenever I access my cart, so whenever I add a new item, I'll take my old cart and create the new cart of this old cart. And I want to be able to check if a certain product ID, like from the Call of Duty game, for example, already exists in this cart. And if yes, then I will only, well, update the quantity and so on, so that I will not push a new product in there. So to make this a bit less theoretical, if I add an item here, I'll first create a new variable, name it stored item, and this should be my existing items where I want to see if this ID already exists. Now rightfully you would say, well, this items is an array. How the ID here probably won't exist since the array index probably won't be matching any MongoDB ID. And you would be right, so items here shouldn't be an empty array. But as I said, I always want to recreate my cart. So items will indeed be an object, or more specifically, it will be my old cart's items. So I'll name this init items, and I'll pass those items to my constructor. So with that, whenever I recreate my cart, I pass my old cart into it. This old cart's items will be, well, assigned here to my items. And with that, I'm able to check if my items, which is an object in the end, where the key is the product ID, if they already have this key, this product ID. If yes, I know the product already was added to the cart, and I'll then work with that. So here I'm basically retrieving this. And of course, I don't know if I'll get a stored item because the item might not have been added to the cart yet. In this case, it would have to be added newly. So I'll check if I'm able to get this. If not, this is this case here, if I'm not retrieving the stored item, I'll create a new one. So then I'll set it equal to items ID still, but both will be assigned to a new object where I'll have my item to be my item, the one I add here. The quantity should be 0 because I'll increment it in the next step. And the price should also be 0 because I'll also increment or add the price in the next step. So with that, I'm creating a new entry. I'll give it a key to be the product ID here in this step. And I'm also assigning it to the stored item. So I'm just doing both in one step here. So in the next step here, I'll then increase the quantity by 1. And I'll of course also change my price to be equal to my item's price. And then of course times my quantity, just to make sure that the price of this group, and that is referring to the group here, is the price of the individual item times the quantity of this individual item. Of course, I also have to go to my total quantity and increase this by 1. And the same is true for the total price, which should be stored item price. So the price, or which gets added the aggregated price of this product group. So I hope this is clear how this works, that I'm either adding a new product group if the product hasn't been added to the cart before, or if it has been added, then I'm skipping this step here and I'm only increasing quantity and price. This is all I'm doing here in this add function. Now back to the top here, since I'm adding my old cart, currently I'm only adding the old items. However, I can improve this. I can change this to be old cart and then access the items of my old cart. And here, of course, the total quantity, and then here the total price. And as I explained, this is only needed because I'm recreating the cart whenever I do something with it, whenever I add new items. So therefore, I'm passing the old cart. I'm, basically fetching all the old data, fetching all the items already in the cart, total quantity and price, of course, and then I'm able to call my add function here to add a new item to my cart here. That's all I'm doing here. Now I want to add another function here. I'll name it generate array, and what this function will allow me to do is it will give me my cart items as an array, because remember, currently items will be an object. It needs to be an object because my my items here are stored with a key being the product ID. So I need to be able to have kind of a JavaScript object, because an array would not allow me to do this. I can't set my own key in an array. So therefore, I still need to be able to transform it into an array if I want to output it in a list or something like this. So I'll write a helper function for this. I'll write the empty array, which I will return in the end. And then I will have a simple for loop where I loop through my items for the keys in my items here specifically. And I will push an element on my array. And the element I want to push, of course, is the value of each of my items. So the individual item itself. And then I will return my array. And remember, this is just needed to be able to then output a list of my product groups later on. So that's the card constructor. And to sum it up, what it does is it basically gets the old card when we create it. If we create it the first time, this will be an empty JavaScript object. We will then assign the values of the old card, so items, quantity, and price. We have a function to be able to add a new item to the card. And here we have to check if this item already, or this item group, this product group already exists in the card. If not, we create a new one. If yes, well, we don't. We then just access the old one existing group. In both ways, after this first step, we increase the quantity by 1 and we adjust the price. And of course, we also update the total quantity and price. So with all that done, I'll head over to the index.js routes file here, where I will have my add to cart route here. And here I'll create my cart. As explained, a new cart will be created each time we add a new item. But of course, I want to pass my old cart if I do have this. So I'll access my session, and here I'll later store it in a cart property. So I check if this cart property exists with a ternary expression here. And if it does exist, then I will pass my old cart. Otherwise, as explained, I'll pass an empty JavaScript object. So that's all I'm doing here, just making sure that if I already have a cart in a session, I'm passing that, otherwise, empty object. With that, I'll next use Mongoose to find my product here, find it by ID. I'm getting the product ID through the parameter here. And of course, I'll also specify my callback here. And inside this callback here, you would of course also check if we have an error. And in this case, you want to return a response. Let's simply say we return a redirect to the root page. Of course, in a real application, you probably want to do a little bit more, show some error message and so on. But I want to focus on the other part here. So if we don't have an error, and that's the case I'm assuming here, then I will add a product to my cart here. So call the add method on my cart object, which I created here. And of course, I need to pass my product, the one I just fetched from the database, and the product ID to identify it, or to create the identifier. And yes, of course, you could only pass the product and extract the ID in the add method, but this way it's written a bit more generic, and you could also use it if the product you passed doesn't have the ID itself. So here I'm next storing this in my cart object in my session, just like that. And the Express session will automatically save with each response we send back. So we don't have to save this. It will be saved as soon as the response has been sent. And therefore our session is safe. And then I'll also redirect to the, let's say, product page. So with all that, we'll probably have a working session and cart, but you wouldn't be able to see this, right? So in order to see this, what I'll do is I'll just log my session cart here and increase the size of my console restart the server, and then just have a look, I wanted to say, but we don't have to have a look because I forgot one thing. I just remembered that. I, of course, also need to import my card here at the top. So require models card. That's, of course, important. Otherwise, we would get an error for sure. So now with that, I'll restart my server, reload this page, and I'll click on Add to Shopping Cart to get a not found page. Now, the reason for that is that I forgot something in my shop. Here, Add to Cart, of course, also expects to get the parameter. So here, when I access my Add to Cart route, I should probably add this. So I'll enter handlebars here to simply access the ID of my product. So with that, I don't even need to restart the server because I only changed my template. I'll navigate back to the product page and I'll try this again. Now at least we get a real error, so let's see what happened. The problem we got here is maybe a bit hard to spot. You could think that this line would be the problem, since we try to access something on an undefined object. However, this item is only undefined because if I pass old card to be an empty JavaScript object, then of course old card items is undefined instead of an empty JavaScript object, because items doesn't exist on that empty object. So one fix would be to not pass an empty object, but instead to set the items key here like this, and make this an empty object as well, and this should work. But another way, of course, is to fix it in here to basically check if old card is an empty object and then assign it. So I'll go with the first fix here by setting items equal to an empty JavaScript object. And now if I rerun my server here, and I can just refresh here to try to re-add this. This kind of seemed to work. So let's have a look if I can see it. And you can see in the console that we printed our card here. However, total quantity and total price don't look necessarily right. The individual object here looks fine though. We got the object, the quantity, and the price, but total quantity and price weren't updated. So if we have a look at our card, these two functions here, or these two lines, failed. Now we have this failure for the same reason as why the items had problems. When we pass an empty object to create this new card, or as an old card, then we set the total quantity and price to these fields in the old card, which is undefined at the beginning. Now then we would try to increment undefined and add a new price to undefined, and that of course won't work. So in order to fix this, we also need to change this here. And now I'm going to show you the other way I was mentioning before. Currently I'm passing this empty card with the empty items, and I could do the same for passing quantity and price to be equal to 0, but I don't really like that approach. I don't want to have that logic in this file, so I'll go back to passing an empty object here. Instead, I'll go back to my card and I'll use another operator. I'll use the Boolean OR here to say either do this, but if this is undefined, use an empty object. And I'll do the same here. If this is undefined, well then use 0, and the same for the price. And with that, I'm giving my card the flexibility to assign the right values depending on whether it's brand new and an old card isn't existing or not. So that is certainly a great way to solve this issue. Now with that, I'm saving this and I'll restart my server. Now the issue you'll probably have is you already have a session because it was created, but it's kind of broken. It does have this not a number quantity or stuff like that. So in order to easily reset it, you may open up your developer tools in Chrome, for example, go to cookies, localhost, and simply delete this cookie here, this connect Mongo cookie. That's the cookie of the session, and now if you reload your page, your session will be gone. So now if I add a new shopping cart item, and I'll go back to my project, let's have a look. Now this looks much better. We got this item, we got a quantity of 1, a price of 40, and this matches the overall quantity and price. Now if I add it a second time and I go back, well, that looks almost good. We got quantity 2, price 80, total quantity, and total price is wrong. And the reason for that is, of course, that we have an error here. When we increase the total price, we take it the old total price plus the stored item price. Now that is of course not correctly, because the stored item price is also quantity times price. So therefore I'm adding too much. But of course a very easy fix is to simply take the item price. So now I'm not taking the aggregate price, but only the price of the single item which was added. So now if I restart this, and of course I'll also reset my session again by deleting this cookie. If I now reload, I'll add this to shopping cart. We'll have a look. This looks good. If I add it a second time, this now also looks good. Now if I add another item, let's say World of Warcraft, you see we now get 2 items, quantity 2, price 80. Thank you. And the overall also looks great. So that has been quite some work, but I hope you saw how we got there, and I hope these little errors helped you to understand where the difficult parts here are and how to get them right, and how to also, well, think about this process of, well, creating this card brand new each time and having to consider the aspect of either having an empty cart or existing items, adding the price correctly, and so on. It's more difficult than you think, but in the end also not that difficult if you look at that code here. So that has been the creation of the card. The next step, of course, is to also, well, see it somewhere on the page and not only here in our console.